Data is becoming more and more important. There's hardly a business out there that would not be interested in collecting data about its own operations, typically with the goal of gaining insights and learning from it. But simply gathering and subsequently owning data is just the very first step, because having relevant data is a necessary but not a sufficient precondition. Because whoever owns data only has just that data. What one actually wants are not data, but the information hidden within this data. And to extract this information, the data first needs to be prepared, analyzed, and finally evaluated. And that's not as simple as it sounds, and historically there have been several approaches to this, including the concepts of data lakes and data meshes mentioned in the title of this video. But what are they exactly? What's the difference between a data lake and a data mesh? And while we're at it, what exactly is a data warehouse, and what do all these terms mean? Why is one better or worse than the other? Why has the hype around data lakes already passed? Why are data meshes the latest trend? And so on. And all these questions are what today's video is all about. So with that in mind, hello and welcome to our new Developers Dictionary. The fact that data has taken on a whole new dimension in many companies is apparent not least from the job postings. Data analysts, data engineers, data scientists, and so on are being sought, especially in connection with tasks and jobs that target artificial intelligence, machine learning, and the like. Because these concepts, or rather the technologies associated with them, generally aim at evaluating and analyzing data in one way or another. And this is a phenomenon of the past, let's say, 10 to a maximum of 15 years. Before that, it did not exist in this order of magnitude, in this form, and in this configuration. And this is not least because in the last 10 to 15 years, artificial intelligence has also made enormous progress, which in turn is largely due to the fact that only during this time has the hardware become powerful enough to calculate models that actually provide a professional benefit. This, I think, can be seen very nicely in neural networks. How they fundamentally work is not different today than it was in the 1950s, but only today is the necessary computing power available to also use neural networks with numerous layers and millions or even billions of neurons. And this largely explains the soaring popularity of deep learning. However, nowadays, not everything is immediately and always directly artificial intelligence and machine learning, even though the media sometimes make you believe that. Good old statistics are still relevant, and classic algorithms for data analysis, such as k-means or linear regression, are also still helpful tools. You don't need an LLM, that is a large language model, or a convolutional neural network, or whatever, for everything. The classic algorithms often still do their job very well. That means, as so often, the rule here is also the right tool for the job. But the point is that completely independent of the question of which algorithms and with what methodology you want to dissect data, you first need the data. And all these approaches have in common that you need a lot of data. This means that this is one of the reasons why companies collect data today, because otherwise the algorithms would not work, or at least not as well. Collecting the data is not so difficult in the first place. In fact, that's the easiest part of the task, because all you must do is capture and store it. But that's where the problem starts, because where and how do you store the data? And by that I don't mean the question of database versus file system, which format to use, whether SQL or NoSQL and so on, but the question is rather, how do you structure the data storage from a conceptual point of view? And this is where you inevitably encounter the term data warehouse. This must be one of the few remaining hype terms from the 80s and 90s, and to put it simply, a data warehouse is nothing more than a huge central database where all the company's data is stored in a structured and normalized form so that it can be queried and analyzed in a uniform manner later, often referred to as data mining. I don't want to delve too much into these terms at this point, because the big hype around data warehouses has long since passed, and one of the biggest problems is simply that no one has an overview of all a company's data and could centrally decide what a suitable, normalized form would be for all conceivable use cases. So while this sounds fantastic in theory, An orderly and well-structured catalog of all data relevant to the company in a uniform format. The practice often looks quite different, that these are in fact projects that cost lots of money, are planned in an ivory tower and completely miss reality, and on balance they are far from as efficient or effective as originally promised. Therefore, things have calmed down significantly around data warehouses, and rightfully so, at least in my opinion. The whole thing was replaced around 2010 by a new buzzword, namely the data lake. The idea was that it would be a good thing in principle to be able to provide all data relevant to the company in a central place, and this is not where the concept of the data warehouse failed, but maybe we should better let go of the uniform structure, standardization, normalization, and so on of the data, because that was the big mistake with the data warehouses, assuming that it would be possible at all. Turns out, a data lake is an even sillier idea than a data warehouse, because if you simply throw data together in a central place in a non-cohesive and completely unstructured form, then theoretically you have everything, but in practice you will never find anything again. Even with the data that you have stored there yourself, it becomes very difficult, and with data that comes from other departments or divisions, it becomes practically impossible. If you ever find anything again there at all, it's more by accident than because you specifically searched for it. Personally, the concept of the data lake always strongly reminds me of the way companies conduct knowledge management in SharePoint, Confluence and Co. Here, too, everything is often just thrown together without any predefined sensible structure, let alone a concept, and here as well you usually find very little ever again, and that only with great difficulties. And if you unexpectedly find something, it's often hopelessly outdated and not maintained, so that you can't do too much with it in the end. In the field of data lakes, a nice term has been established for this state, where the formerly idyllic, clear mountain lake becomes an increasingly dirty and impenetrable body of water. This is then called a so-called data swamp. Indeed, another problem is added. Both the data warehouse and the data lake assume that it is sufficient to have the data, and that it must only be properly arranged and structured, in the case of the data warehouse, or made reasonably accessible in the case of the data lake. However, both are insufficient, as they neglect a very essential aspect of data, that is, the context of data, how the data was created, how and for what it's being used, its relevance, etc. And this context, basically the other side of the story, is the business processes. Without a detailed knowledge of the processes, it's enormously difficult, if not impossible, to properly evaluate, understand, analyze data, and so on. And this is a typical perspective that has remained from the 80s and 90s as well. The database is at the center of everything, and you just need to have a database that is powerful enough, then all other problems will vanish into air. But this is simply not true, because the moment I only look at the data when looking at the inner workings of a company, and I ignore the processes, I lose the semantics that lie behind the data. It's not just the mere existence of a record and the record's values that are relevant, but also how, and especially why, it was originally created, what purpose it serves, and in which processes it will be involved in the future. And I learned this from the processes, and if I ignore them, I get a very poor and especially a completely distorted picture. And this is where the data mesh comes into play. This is the latest hype term in the field of data processing. It originates back to 2019, and it breaks with exactly this data-centric thinking. A data mesh is the idea of storing data in a decentralized way, namely where it belongs, that is, with the respective teams that have the expertise and who control the processes from which the data has emerged. This means, in the very first step, one explicitly abandons the idea of centrally storing the complete data of a company. This has the great advantage that I must deal with much smaller data areas, and that for each data area, just that domain team is responsible that also develops and operates the associated applications. This means if I need data analysis on, let's say, finance data, it's not some unrelated data team that belongs nowhere in the organization, but I turn to the team that takes care of the technical aspects of finance anyway. After all, it is their data, and they know this data. They know its structure, its setup, and they know the associated processes. That means that it's relatively easy for them, at least certainly much easier than for a general purpose data team, to develop and provide the desired analysis. But this now applies not only to finance, but to any department within the company. Thus, the data mesh is initially the idea of building isolated islands of data. However, the basic idea of data warehouses and data lakes was precisely that one cannot only access the data of individual departments in isolation, but also the collected data of the entire company, because this allows for completely different conclusions and insights. And this is where the term mesh comes into play. Because if there are a uniform format for data, uniform protocols and uniform interfaces for how data is provided by the individual domain teams, then it suddenly becomes easy to make cross-department or cross-team evaluations. Then one can query the data from the relevant isolated islands individually and then connect, integrate and analyze them at a higher level. That is, exactly at this point, a network of data is created, which is the so-called data mesh. For the individual domain teams, this means that there must be a uniform standard for how data is provided. This means there needs to be a definition of what data APIs should look like, which formats and protocols are to be used, how queries are to be formulated, and so on. And the domain teams must be able to extract information from their own domain-specific data for all possible different perspectives. And this is not easy, but it's doable. And here the concept of the data mesh meets the concepts of domain-driven design, that is DDD, and event sourcing, because a data mesh is ultimately nothing more than the data-driven view of microservices developed with DDD and event sourcing and the network that can be created from it. And when you consider this, it initially sounds to me like a much smarter and more sustainable data architecture, and I can well imagine that data meshes will not suffer the same fate as data warehouses and data lakes before them. That is, even though it may seem like it right now, data mesh is not just a hype term, but actually a viable data architecture which particularly helps to integrate the worlds of data analysis and development rather than portraying them as two separate areas. In the end, they are simply two sides of the same story. What do you think of this? What experience have you had with data warehouses, data lakes, data swamps, and so on? Do you know the problems I have mentioned, or have you possibly ever seen it well done before? And have you ever heard of the data mesh architecture before watching this video? And regardless of whether yes or no, what do you think of it? Feel free to write your opinion down in the comments below. I would be very happy about that. And independent of this, if you liked the video today, feel free to share it with your colleagues, leave a thumbs up, and then finally, I wish you a good start into the new week. Always take good care of yourself, stay healthy, and then we'll see each other again next time. In this sense, take care. Bye.